The day started like any other ordinary school day. I remember the final bell ringing, signaling the end of classes, and the joyous rush of students eager to escape the confines of the building. I slung my backpack over my shoulder and began the short walk home. The weather was unremarkable, gray and overcast, casting a dreary shadow over the suburban streets. Little did I know, something far more ominous was casting its shadow over my quiet neighborhood. As I turned the corner onto my street, I noticed an unusual number of blackbirds congregating on the lawn of my neighbor, Mrs. Thompson. It was strange to see so many of them gathered together, their inky feathers stark against the dull green grass. Curious and feeling a mischievous urge, I decided to run towards them to see them scatter into the sky. The thrill of watching them burst into flight always gave me a strange sense of satisfaction. I broke into a sprint, my sneakers slapping against the pavement. The birds remained oddly still until I was almost upon them. With a sudden cacophony of caws and flapping wings, they took off, revealing what they had been feasting on. I skidded to a halt, my breath catching in my throat as the scene before me registered in my mind. There, sprawled on the grass, was the body of a woman. Her clothes were torn, and her pale skin was marred with deep, ragged wounds where the birds had been pecking. Blood stained the ground around her, creating a gruesome contrast to the green of the lawn. For a moment, I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, and my heart pounded in my chest. The woman's face was turned towards me, her eyes wide open in a final, frozen expression of terror. Recognition hit me like a punch to the gut. It was Mrs. Thompson. She had always been kind to me, offering cookies and lemonade on hot summer days. The sight of her now, lifeless and mutilated, was too much to bear. I stumbled backward, my legs finally responding to the adrenaline surging through my veins. I fumbled for my phone, my hand shaking so badly it was hard to dial 911. When the operator answered, I could barely get the words out. "There's a body, Mrs. Thompson. Birds," I stammered, my voice barely more than a whisper. The operator's calm voice guided me through the conversation, and soon I heard the distant wail of sirens. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the horrific sight. Time seemed to stretch and warp, each second feeling like an eternity. When the police arrived, they quickly cordoned off the area and ushered me to the side. I watched numbly as they worked, taking photographs, collecting evidence, and covering Mrs. Thompson's body with a sheet. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: shock, horror, grief. How could this happen in our quiet neighborhood? As the investigation unfolded, the grim details began to emerge. Mrs. Thompson had been attacked in her own home, dragged outside, and left for dead. The birds, attracted by the scent of blood, had descended upon her, turning an already horrific scene into something straight out of a nightmare. The police questioned everyone in the neighborhood, but no one had seen or heard anything unusual. It was as if the darkness had come out of nowhere, shattering the peace of our community. The unease settled over the neighborhood like a shroud, and the sight of black birds became an unsettling reminder of the horror that had unfolded. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of that afternoon haunted my every step. I couldn't walk past Mrs. Thompson's house without feeling a chill run down my spine. I had nightmares about the birds, their beady eyes and sharp beaks haunting my dreams. The image of her lifeless body, torn and bloodied, was burned into my mind. The police eventually made an arrest, a drifter who had been passing through the area. He confessed to the crime, but the details of his motive were never fully understood. It didn't bring much comfort. The damage had been done, and the sense of security I once felt in my neighborhood was shattered forever. To this day, I can't look at a flock of blackbirds without feeling a deep, gnawing fear. They serve as a grim reminder of the day I lost my innocence, the day I discovered that true horror can be found in the most unexpected places. The day I realized that sometimes the monsters aren't hiding in the dark, they're right next door. I remember it was around 7 p.m. when it all started. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and a creeping darkness enveloped the neighborhood. I was alone at home, enjoying a rare moment of solitude after a hectic week at work. I had just settled down on the couch with a cup of tea and a book, relishing the silence. The doorbell rang, shattering the tranquility. I frowned, not expecting anyone. With a slight sigh, I set my book down and walked to the door. As I reached for the handle, a sense of unease washed over me. Something felt off. When I opened the door, my heart nearly stopped. There stood my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who lived next door. Her face was pale, contorted in pain and terror. But what truly froze my blood was the sight of a knife sticking out of her back, the handle protruding grotesquely from between her shoulder blades. "Help me," she gasped, clutching the door frame for support. I stood there, paralyzed by shock for what felt like an eternity but was likely only a second. Snapping out of my stupor, I rushed to her side, carefully guiding her into the house. She collapsed onto the couch, blood seeping through her clothing and staining the fabric. "Who did this to you?" I asked, my voice trembling. She struggled to speak, her breaths shallow and ragged. "I don't know. Someone broke into my house. I tried to fight them off." I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but every second felt like an eternity. I tried to keep Mrs. Henderson conscious, talking to her in soothing tones, but her eyes were glazing over. "Stay with me, Mrs. Henderson," I pleaded. "The ambulance is coming." Her grip on my hand was weak, her skin cold and clammy. She opened her mouth to say something, but all that came out was a pained gasp. I looked around helplessly, my mind racing. Should I try to remove the knife? Should I apply pressure around it? I remembered reading somewhere that removing a knife could cause more damage, so I resisted the urge. Finally, I heard the distant wail of sirens. Relief flooded through me as the paramedics burst through the door, quickly assessing the situation. They worked with practiced efficiency, stabilizing her and preparing to transport her to the hospital. I watched helplessly as they carried her out, her blood staining their gloves and uniforms. As the paramedics left, a police officer stayed behind to ask me questions. I recounted everything I knew, which wasn't much. The officer took notes, his expression grim. "Did you see anyone suspicious around her house?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, I was inside the whole time. I didn't hear anything until she rang the doorbell." He nodded, jotting down my response. "We'll need to investigate her home. Do you have a spare key?" I hesitated, then nodded. Mrs. Henderson had given me a spare key for emergencies. I retrieved it from a drawer and handed it over. The officer thanked me and left, leaving me alone in my blood-stained living room. I felt numb, the shock of the evening's events catching up to me. I cleaned up the best I could, but the stains on the couch were a stark reminder of what had happened. That night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind set my nerves on edge. I kept imagining Mrs. Henderson's terrified face, the knife in her back, the blood. My mind conjured up horrible scenarios of what could have happened to her and who could have done such a thing. The next day, I visited her at the hospital. She was in critical condition, but the doctors were hopeful. I sat by her bedside, holding her hand, feeling an overwhelming sense of sadness and helplessness. Days turned into weeks, and the police investigation seemed to stall. There were no leads, no suspects. The neighborhood, once a safe and quiet place, now felt sinister and threatening. I found myself looking over my shoulder, double-checking the locks, and jumping at every unexpected sound. Mrs. Henderson eventually recovered, but she was never the same. The trauma had taken its toll, both physically and mentally. She moved away, unable to bear living in the place where she had been attacked. The incident left a lasting scar on our neighborhood. We all became more cautious, more suspicious. The sense of community we once had was replaced by an undercurrent of fear. And for me, the memory of that night, the image of Mrs. Henderson with a knife in her back, would forever haunt my dreams. From the moment I noticed the new resident on our street, something about him felt off. He moved into the small house across from mine, and while I hadn't seen any moving trucks or other signs of a typical move-in, he was just there one day. At first I thought he might be shy or introverted, always keeping to himself, but it quickly became clear that his behavior was more than just odd. Every day, from morning until evening, he would either sit on his balcony or stand by the window, staring out into the neighborhood. It didn't matter the time of day, he was always there, watching. At first, I brushed it off as him being lonely or perhaps just a people watcher. But the more I noticed him, the more unnerved I became. It was a week after he moved in that I realized he had memorized my schedule. He knew when I left for work, when I came back, and even my weekend routines. I could feel his eyes on me whenever I was outside, like a tangible weight. It was disconcerting, to say the least. One evening, as I was walking home from work, I saw him standing by his window, staring directly at me. His eyes were dark, almost hollow, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I quickened my pace, desperate to get inside the safety of my home. But before I could reach my door, I heard his voice call out to me. "Hey, wait a moment." I turned reluctantly to see him stepping out onto his balcony. He waved and smiled, but there was something predatory in his grin. "Hi," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can I help you?" He nodded eagerly. "I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Tom. I moved in recently and thought it'd be nice to get to know my neighbors." "Nice to meet you, Tom," I said, forcing a polite smile. "I'm just getting home from work, so maybe another time?" He frowned slightly, as if disappointed. "Oh, come on, it won't take long. I have something for you, a gift." I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to refuse, but not wanting to be rude. "Maybe another time," I repeated. "I've had a long day." Tom's smile faltered, and his eyes hardened. "It'll only take a minute," he insisted, more forcefully this time. "Come inside, please." My heart raced as I took a step back. "No, really, I need to go. Maybe tomorrow." He moved quickly, coming down the steps of his porch and closing the distance between us. "It won't take long," he said, his voice now a dangerous whisper. "Just come inside." I felt trapped, my mind racing for a way out. Just as I was about to scream for help, a car pulled up, and a man stepped out. He was middle-aged, with a stern expression and a gun holstered at his side. "Is everything all right here?" the man asked, his voice steady and authoritative. Tom froze, his grip on my arm loosening. I took the opportunity to pull away and step towards the stranger, feeling a surge of relief. "Yes, everything's fine," Tom said quickly, his eyes darting between me and the man. "Just having a chat with my neighbor." The man didn't seem convinced. He looked at me, his gaze piercing. "Is he bothering you?" I nodded, my voice finally finding its way out of my throat. "Yes, he was trying to make me go inside his house." The man's expression darkened. "You should go home," he said to me. "I'll handle this." I didn't need to be told twice. I hurried to my house, locking the door behind me and peeking through the window. The man was talking to Tom, who seemed agitated but didn't resist. After a few moments, Tom retreated into his house, and the man got back into his car and drove off. That night, I barely slept, haunted by the image of Tom's predatory grin and the feeling of his grip on my arm. The next day, I noticed that Tom's house was eerily quiet. His usual spot by the window was empty, and there was no sign of him on the balcony. Days turned into weeks, and I never saw Tom again. His house remained dark and silent, as if he had vanished into thin air. The neighborhood slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Who was Tom? Why was he watching me? And what happened to him after that night? I never found out, but the memory of his cold eyes and sinister smile stayed with me, a chilling reminder of the danger that had lurked so close to home. The rain had been coming down in sheets all evening, casting a pall over the neighborhood. The rhythmic drumming against the roof and windows was soothing in its own way, a comforting background noise as my younger brother Ethan and I played a game of Monopoly in the living room. Our parents had gone to the store to pick up some groceries, leaving us with strict instructions to keep the doors locked and not to answer to anyone. It wasn't the first time they'd left us alone, and at 14, I felt perfectly capable of looking after 11-year-old Ethan. The clock on the mantel chimed 7, and I glanced at it, wondering how much longer Mom and Dad would be. As I rolled the dice, something caught my eye through the rain-slicked window behind Ethan. A figure was standing in our yard, close to the house, peering inside. My heart skipped a beat as I tried to make out his features, but the downpour distorted his face into a ghastly blur. "Ethan, stay here," I whispered, rising to my feet as casually as I could. "I need to check something." I moved towards the window, hoping my movement wouldn't draw his attention. From this angle, I could see him more clearly. He was tall and gaunt, with stringy hair plastered to his forehead, and his clothes were soaked through. His eyes, though, they were wild, darting around as if searching for something or someone. I felt a shiver run down my spine. This wasn't just some lost pedestrian looking for shelter. This man had a purpose. "Is something wrong?" Ethan asked, sensing my unease. I forced a smile. "Probably just a delivery guy looking for the wrong house," I lied. "Stay put, okay?" I hurried to the front door to double-check the locks. They were secure. I checked the back door and the windows, my pulse quickening with each step. Every lock was in place. When I returned to the living room, Ethan was standing by the window staring out. "He's gone," he said quietly, turning to look at me with wide eyes. I felt a momentary relief, but it was short-lived. A loud thud from the back of the house made us both jump. I grabbed Ethan's hand and pulled him towards the stairs. Get to my room, now." We ran up the stairs, my mind racing. I knew we had to call the police, but I didn't want to scare Ethan any more than he already was. Once in my room, I locked the door and grabbed my baseball bat from the corner. I handed Ethan my phone. "Call 911, I instructed, trying to keep my voice steady. "Tell them someone's trying to break in." As Ethan fumbled with the phone, another crash echoed through the house. This time, it was unmistakable, the sound of a window shattering. The intruder was inside. I held the bat tightly, every muscle in my body tense. I could hear him moving around downstairs, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The operator's voice on the phone was a distant murmur as Ethan relayed our address and the situation. I could hear the fear in his voice, and I wished I could do more to protect him. The footsteps grew louder, closer. He was coming up the stairs. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out all other sounds. I positioned myself in front of Ethan, ready to swing at the first sign of danger. The doorknob rattled. Ethan clutched my arm, his eyes wide with terror. The knob twisted violently, but the lock held. The intruder pounded on the door, and I could feel the vibrations through the floorboards. "Police are on their way," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. The pounding stopped, and there was a long moment of silence. Then, the sound of retreating footsteps. He was moving away, back down the stairs. I didn't dare to breathe, straining to hear his movements. Minutes felt like hours, but finally the sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder as they approached. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows, casting eerie shadows across the room. I exhaled a shaky breath, the tension slowly leaving my body. The police arrived, and we could hear their voices downstairs, commanding the intruder to come out with his hands up. Ethan and I stayed locked in the room until a knock came at the door. "It's the police. You can come out now." I opened the door cautiously, the bat still in my hand. A police officer stood there, looking relieved. "You're safe now," he said gently. "He's gone. Gone." The word echoed in my mind. How could he be gone? We followed the officer downstairs, and he explained that they had searched the house and the surrounding area, but there was no sign of the intruder. "Are you sure he was inside?" one officer asked, his brow furrowed. I nodded, my grip tightening on the bat. "We heard him. He broke a window." They found the broken window in the kitchen, glass scattered across the floor, but no other evidence of the man's presence. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Our parents returned home to find the police still there, and we recounted the night's events. They were shaken, but grateful that we were safe. The police promised to patrol the neighborhood more frequently, but it did little to ease the lingering fear. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the rain. Every creak, every rustle of the wind outside set my nerves on edge. The image of the man's wild eyes haunted me, and I knew I would never forget the terror of that night. Even now, I still check the locks obsessively and keep a baseball bat within reach. Because you never know when the shadows outside might come to life, bringing with them a nightmare you can't escape.